Hello, everyone, again. We're going to give everyone another minute for all those who registered to join in and those who are joining us on YouTube Live, and then we'll start. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's panel discussion titled Middle East on the Brink, Ceasefire or Regional War. My name is Bijan Ahmadi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. We are a nonpartisan international affairs think tank operating in the United States and Canada, dedicated to promoting dialogue, diplomacy, prudent realism, and military restraint. Today's discussion focuses on the situation in the Middle East. Over 10 months have passed since the October 7th Hamas attacks against Israel and the beginning of the Gaza war. In Gaza, over 40,000 people have been killed in Israeli military attacks, and around 1.9 million people have been displaced. Gaza's infrastructure, its health system, schools and hospitals have been destroyed. Nearly 109 hostages remain in the captivity of Hamas in Gaza, and it is unclear how many of them are still alive. Since the conflict's onset, the so-called Axis of Resistance, a network of militia groups backed by Iran, has started attacks against Israel to pressure them in support of their ally Hamas. This includes daily attacks against Israel by Lebanese Hezbollah, attacks in the Red Sea against commercial vessels by the Houthis in Yemen, and also targeting of American bases and attempts at targeting Israel by Iraqi militia groups. In recent weeks, tensions reached new heights following the assassinations of senior Hamas and Hezbollah leaders in Tehran and Beirut by Israel, and an Israeli airstrike on the Yemeni port of Hodeidah in retaliation for a Houthi suicide drone attack on Tel Aviv last month. Hezbollah, Iran, and the Houthis have vowed to retaliate against Israel, though the specifics of this retaliation remain unclear. Israel has stated that it will directly respond to any attacks, including potential strikes within Iranian territory, intensifying fears of a broader regional conflict after 10 months of devastation in Gaza. In response, Washington, Doha, and Cairo are making renewed efforts to mediate a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Last week, Washington proposed a bridging solution, suggesting that Hamas must decide whether to accept the deal. However, the proposal, which reportedly includes significant new demands from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been met with skepticism. Egyptian and Qatari mediators have expressed concerns to the Biden administration that Hamas will reject the new Israeli conditions. Another round of negotiations is expected in Egypt this week, which may be the last opportunity to secure a ceasefire in the near term and avoid further regional escalation. To unpack these developments, we're joined by four distinguished experts. From Qatar, Nawaf Al-Thani is the former defense attaché of the state of Qatar to the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and a member of the board of directors of the Gulf International Forum. Joining us from Berlin, Hamid Reza Azizi is a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. From the United States, Randa Salim is the Director of Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues at the Middle East Institute. She's also a non-resident fellow at Johns Hopkins University SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. And last but not least, from Tel Aviv, Raz Dim is a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies, INSS, and a research fellow at the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. Welcome to you all. Thanks to the four of you for joining IPD for this important discussion. To begin our conversation, I would like to ask each panelist to provide us with their perspective on the current situation in the region, and assess this critical question. Are we heading toward a ceasefire or a regional escalation? We'll start with Sheikh Nawaf. Please go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Bijan, and for the Institute for convening this session. I think it comes at a timely moment in our history, but also in the region's future, because anything could go wrong any minute, unfortunately. Now, allow me to start with an analogy. As someone who comes from the Arabian Gulf, the GCC countries, steeped in long traditions of falconry, I think starting with an analogy of falconry, I think is apt to understand the mindset. Viewing the Middle East as the falcon, this unruly bird that you need to control, and the falconer as diplomacy. There are key decisions have to be made by regional and global powers. Does the falconer, choose to tighten its control, risking agitation in the Middle East, or the bird itself? Or does it release the bird and hope for the best and hopefully peace? Well, the fact remains that, unfortunately, right now, when you deal with a situation like that, you have to deal calmly. And I think Qatar, the United States, and Egypt has been dealing calmly. But hoping for the best is not an outcome. There are obviously the strategic environment, is unstable, to say the least. The different web of alliances, rivalries, and unresolved issues do consist a clear challenge for the mediators and negotiators when dealing with the situation in Gaza and beyond. The potential for a ceasefire, well, I mean, all the falconer can do is, when release the bird, is actually use either control and trust to make sure that the falcon actually goes in the right direction. In this case, diplomatic efforts by Qatar, the US, and Egypt have done a lot for rapprochement between the both parties. But fatigue is setting in. Prolonged agitation is setting in, unfortunately, and optimism is turning into pessimism, slowly but unfortunately surely. Now, there are structural factors as well. You look at the modernization in a lot of militaries in the region, gives you an indication of how the region is viewing the future. The ethnic and religious divisions are continuing. Security dilemmas in the Middle East is only growing. And the role of non-state actors as well is somewhat now prominence, as well as being active. Now, we have to emphasize that there is a delicate balance. There is a delicate balance between looking at the Palestinian issue, looking at the economic and political issue in the region, and between safety and security also for Israel. And I think right now we're at the crossroads where, if the negotiating parties do not reach a settlement, which unfortunately, looking at the news today, it doesn't seem like anything is going to happen anytime soon. Unfortunately, I'm sure we're going to get into it more in a bit. Then we do run the real danger, not the theoretical one, but the real danger of a widening conflict that some would say is already here. Lebanon, killed in Lebanon within the hundreds now, and thousands wounded, and over 100,000 from southern Lebanon have been displaced and fled the areas of operations by attack from the IDF. And unfortunately, this is something we're going to see, and unless the parties realize that, and I think they do, but they're maybe gambling on different aspects, we will see this escalation only entering into a broader conflict. So, to give a short answer, do I see hope right now for the negotiations? There's always hope. Do I see that hope dwindling and the window closing fast? No one can deny that is the fact right now.
Thank you, Nawaf. We'll definitely follow up on some of the points you mentioned. Hamid Reza, let's go to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to you, Bijan, and the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for having me on this panel. So I just I would like to actually mention 4 points quickly and basically to give my assessment on the situation. So I share the not so optimistic assessment of the previous distinguished speaker. And I think there's a few reasons for that. First of all, what we've seen, despite the kind of renewed efforts for ceasefire, is actually heightened military posturing and basically increased military preparedness by both sides, by Israel and its allies on one side, and by Iran and the so-called axis of resistance on the other. So starting with what some people call the new phase of Israeli operations in Gaza, and beyond actually this targeted assassinations and kind of more pinpoint operations targeting top commanders of Hezbollah and then Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas. So these operations might have resulted, of course, in the kind of some gap and some weaknesses at the leadership level on the side of the Axis. But at the same time, as we can see, they have only increased the risk of a bigger war, especially when it comes to the promise by Iran and Hezbollah to retaliate. And we can discuss this issue further later in the discussion. But so this is one thing. And also, when we look at Hezbollah unveiling this underground missile facility, for example, Iran, reports about kind of getting prepared for a potential response. All this together doesn't, kind of provide a very promising picture. So the second issue is the fragility of diplomatic efforts, as we've seen in the past few days. Actually, since the start of the war in Gaza, there have been quite a few moments of hope, and then this or that side basically raising conditions that have resulted in the collapse of the process. So one thing is very important here, as far as Iran is concerned. Actually, even if the current ceasefire negotiations result in some sort of a deal and the end of hostilities in Gaza, their calculation, at least as far as I can follow, is that it's not going to result in a complete halt of hostilities in the region, especially in the north. So there's this concern that actually, if Israel agrees to a ceasefire, that might be out of the sort of calculation that now is the time to focus on the north. So at least one side of this equation, which is Iran and its allies in the Axis, are getting prepared for a bigger conflict. Speaking of calculations comes the third point, actually. And so both sides seems to be using the threat of further escalation as a strategic lever in the negotiations, which has been one of the key factors basically leading to where we are right now. So again, speaking of the calculation on the side of Iran and its allies, they seem to believe that the initial goal of preventing Hamas's defeat and total destruction has been already achieved. So they believe that they have basically won the war so far, at least by not losing. And now is the time to win the peace by not allowing Israel to achieve what it hasn't been able to achieve through military means. So this is another hurdle, as I can see. And finally, the regional dynamics, as we can see, we have a region at war, if not a regional war. And other than Gaza, for example, Yemen, Lebanon, even Syria, Iraq, these have become conflicts on their own, which one can have a difficult time imagining how they can really stop once a ceasefire, and even if a ceasefire is achieved in Gaza. So I will stop here, and we can discuss further details later.
Thanks, Hamid Reza. I'll definitely follow up with you on some of the points you mentioned, especially on Iran's strategy. Randa, please go ahead. The floor is yours. You're on mute.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Bijan and the Institute for the invitation. Pleasure to share the virtual podium with the colleagues here. Well, the question was, are we heading to a ceasefire or regional escalation in the Middle East? And my answer is neither. Let me start with the regional escalation. I don't think we're going to a regional escalation, mainly because none of the parties, principal local parties that are involved in this fight, meaning Israel, Iran, Hezbollah right now, and the external stakeholders, the US, are interested in in having a regional escalation. Definitely, the US has been from the beginning of this war against such an escalation and has used different tools at its disposal to send messaging and to, increase defenses, military posture to prevent such an escalation. I think on the local side, I think the cost-benefit calculus of each of these principal parties regarding regional escalation remains against, not in favor of a regional escalation. None of them sees a regional escalation will be to their benefit. And so we are likely to be engaged in a period of protracted warfare of the kind that we have seen for the last 10 months. Now there is always a question about, a mistake can happen and by any of these local parties, and that can be dragged into a regional escalation. I think by now, the mistake, the idea or the probability of a mistake happening is quite low. Certain rules of the game have been established. Some gets violated, new ones get established through violent means, not through diplomacy. But also I would argue that not only do these enemies understand each other very well, but also there are indirect communication channels that are constantly operating, which can prevent that kind of, either prevent that mistake from happening through miscommunication, misperception, whatever, but also can contain, the repercussion of a mistake if it were to happen quickly. So I think we are in for the same kind of warfare for some time until, exhaustion sets in, until, some of the parties decide the military means are not going to get them there. I mean, this is how I see it. Now, a ceasefire, I join the two colleagues who have spoken, and by saying the likelihood of a ceasefire is low, if not present at all at the moment, and partly because, again, the calculation of the parties, and primarily the Israeli prime minister. I mean, reports have been leaking from different sources, including Israeli sources, that he remains the primary obstacles to getting to a deal by putting new conditions after understandings are reached, and now with this latest demand about the Philadelphia corridor, it's not only about Hamas and Israel. Now the issue is about Egypt and Israel. So that's another level of complication to the level of to the basically deal making process. And so whether there are pressure points that can be put on the Israeli prime minister to change his calculus about the benefits to himself of a deal. There are internal pressure points. I used to hear from Israeli colleagues in the past that once hostages start coming back in body bags, that will, increase the pressure on the prime minister. We have not seen that happen to date. External pressure, we have not seen the US president willing to deploy the sticks that previous US presidents have deployed to change Israeli prime minister's behavior or to persuade them, to entice them. Carrots have been used throughout the process by the US vis-a-vis Israel, continue to do that. Recently, the approval of $20 billion of weapons, sales to Israel. And we have not seen sticks being used in an effective way, or in a way that can be leveraged to change the calculation of the Israeli prime minister. I think that there is a question to be raised long term. It's about this alliance restraint, the ability of the US-Israeli alliance, and especially the relationship between the US and Israel, and what kind of limits it poses on US presidents going forward in terms of influencing the behavior of Israeli prime minister, and not only Mr. Netanyahu, but even prime ministers in the past. I think that's going to be interesting to watch going forward. So basically, in short, I think we are not going to go into regional escalation, and we are not going to go into a ceasefire.
Thank you, Randa. I'll ask Ras to provide his opening assessment as well, and then we'll follow up on some of the points you mentioned. Ras, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Bijan, and the Institute for this invitation. This is one of the rare occasions when you want your assessment to prove wrong, but I have to share my pessimistic assessment. I'll try to explain that. Look, I think that with the exception perhaps of the few first days of the war in Gaza, where there were voices inside Israel to try and attack Hezbollah and concentrate our efforts with Lebanon and not in Gaza, for the entire last 10 or 11 months, the perception in Israel has been that Israel should concentrate its efforts in Gaza and try to refrain from being engaged in another war, full-scale war with Hezbollah. And another part of this perception was that the key to any kind of settlement in the north, which will allow the Israelis to go back to their communities, goes through Gaza, based on this linkage created by Hassan Nasrallah between the war in Gaza and what's going on in Lebanon. I think that today there are more and more voices inside Israel, including my own, that don't think that this perception is no longer valid, and I explain why. First, I have to share the skepticism of my colleagues here about the prospects of reaching any kind of ceasefire in Gaza. Even if you ignore, and it's very difficult to ignore the political considerations of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the considerations of Yahya Sinwar, I think it will be very difficult. I wouldn't say impossible, but very difficult to bridge between the two basic objectives of both Israel and Hamas. And to be very short, Israel doesn't want and will not allow to go back to the status quo which existed before October the 7th. And even if we reach some kind of a ceasefire, and even if we reach the first stage of any kind of agreement with Hamas, I think it's only a matter of time until Israel will renew its military efforts, perhaps not in the same way we saw during the last 10 months, but in order to make sure that Hamas doesn't have the ability to rehabilitate its military infrastructure and capabilities, Israel is going to continue its efforts, its military efforts in Gaza. On the other hand, Hamas, in my view, and I'm not an expert on Hamas, but I would say that Hamas wants to return to the status quo as much as possible, even if it has to give up its political and ruling capabilities in Gaza. It will try to rehabilitate its military capabilities. So I think that the prospects for reaching a permanent ceasefire in Gaza seem to be very, very low. The second thing, or the second reason I think that the perspective in Israel that you can contain the situation in Lebanon until there is a ceasefire in Gaza is the fact that there are more and more assessments in Israel saying, look, even if we reach some kind of agreement in Gaza, it will not be enough to convince Hassan Nasrallah to not to return to the status quo which existed between Israel and Lebanon until October the 7th or the 8th. And that regardless of the question whether Hezbollah or Iran will try to retaliate against the killing of both Hania and Fuad Shukr. So I think that there are more and more voices inside Israel, and I can elaborate on them later on, that Israel should try to change the status quo and not agree to continue this war of equations or games of equation between Israel and Hezbollah. And just looking at what happened over the last few days, Israeli 2 attacks in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. Then yesterday's attack by Hezbollah against communities, against settlements in northern Israel, which were not evacuated since the war. This, in my view, presents the fact that the status quo, which existed since the beginning of the war, may not be managed as good as possible, despite what we've seen over the last few months. And again, the bottom line is that regardless of whether Iran or Hezbollah are going to retaliate, I think it's going to be very difficult to maintain or to contain this ongoing warfare, limited warfare between Israel and Hezbollah. So even if we don't reach a regional confrontation, and I agree with Randall on this, we can certainly find ourselves in a full-scale military confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah.
Thank you, Raz. Let me actually follow up with you.
Can I add?
Sure, Randa, go ahead.
Quickly,
go ahead and then I'll follow.
Because I think Raz's point is extremely important and it's something I would like to add. Question, to comment on, which is will a war on the northern front between Israel and Hezbollah ignite a regional escalation? And I think Raz answered it. It will not. And I think I would qualify it. I agree with him. It will not, because it depends on what type of war and is waged, how wide it is. And more importantly, will it again consist an existential threat to Hezbollah? Like with Hamas, the war proved to be a failure at being an existential threat to Hamas. I think with Hezbollah, again, the kind of war that Israel might wage will not constitute an existential threat to Hezbollah. And because of that, I don't see that devolving into a regional escalation. I just wanted to add this qualification.
Sure, no, that's definitely an important point. Raz, let me follow up with you. Much of the recent commentary focuses on Prime Minister Netanyahu as a major obstacle to reaching a ceasefire deal in Israel. Your assessment was different, but you know that a lot of the commentaries being published these days, they focus on Netanyahu and his coalition. However, some analysts argue that it's hard to believe that Netanyahu would take these recent actions without the support of the Israeli establishment. And you also mentioned these voices that do not want Israel to go back to the status quo that existed prior to October 7th. For example, consider the assassinations of senior Hezbollah military leader in Beirut, and particularly Ismail Hania's assassination in Tehran. I would like to hear your assessment. Are we dealing with just a rogue politician and his coalition, or is there a broader calculation by the Israeli security and military establishment that believe these actions are necessary to restore Israel's deterrence post-October 7th? So I want you to kind of dig deeper in those voices that you mentioned in your opening statements that do not want Israel to go back to the status quo prior to October 7th.
Look, I'm the last one to ignore the personal political considerations of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I don't know if it's 20% other considerations and 80% political consideration or 70-30. There are certainly political consideration in what Netanyahu is doing, including in his decisions whether to go forward towards a deal with Hamas. But only this morning there was a report in Israel, and I assume it's correct, that following yesterday's attack by Hezbollah against the Golan Heights, where the Hezbollah targeted a civilian town not evacuated since the war, there was a demand by the military to carry out much further attacks against Hezbollah as a retaliation. And at least according to this report, they were not approved by Prime Minister Netanyahu to do that. And I think we should not make ourselves easy lives, but by putting all the blame on Prime Minister Netanyahu. I do think that there are more voices, as I said before, within the Israeli security and military establishment to try and become more proactive and to take the initiative in order to change the equation between Israel, both between Israel and Hezbollah and Israel and Iran. It's not just a matter of returning or maintaining our deterrence, which was certainly defeated after October the 7th. That's part of the explanation. I certainly think that some of the voices within the Israeli military to be more proactive and to try and move forward towards Hezbollah can be explained by the failure of October the 7th. But I think that there are more and more pressure from within the public opinion in Israel, from inside the politicians in Israel, not just Prime Minister Netanyahu. You can hear those voices even within the so-called opposition in Israel, even the centrist and left opposition. There are more and more voices within the, I would say, the local leadership of the communities in Israel. Most of them were evacuated, had to leave their houses after the war to do something in order to change the status quo. And even though I agree with Randa that even if we reach a confrontation, a full-scale confrontation with Hezbollah, it will probably not be enough to defeat Hezbollah. Nobody in Israel thinks that it will defeat Hezbollah or the majority of the strategic capabilities of Hezbollah. But again, there are more and more pressures in Israel that Israel should not allow this status quo to continue. Israel should not allow Iran to continue its efforts to orchestrate this so-called axis of resistance without paying a higher price for that. Israel should not allow Hezbollah to continue to play this game of equation without being exposed to more risks from Israel. So I think that we should regard both the assassination of Fuad Shukr and the killing of Hania as part of this campaign, which is certainly supported not just by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but by the security and military system in Israel to do more in order to take a higher toll from both Iran and Hezbollah for what they have been doing since the beginning of the war.
Thank you, Raz. Randa, quick follow-up with you, and then I'll go to Hamid Reza and Sheikh Nawaf. Regarding Hezbollah, they have vowed to retaliate for the assassination of their military leader, yet their response has been unexpectedly delayed. Is Hezbollah awaiting the outcome of the ceasefire negotiations? And also, what retaliation do you expect to see? Also, if this protracted war that you mentioned that you expect to continue between Hezbollah and Israel, if that continues, do you think that Hezbollah at some point, if there is a ceasefire, if the war in Gaza ends, are they going to concede in diplomatic negotiations to pull back their special forces, their Radvan forces, I believe they're called, from the close to the proximity of the Israeli border? As Raz said, that is the expectation, or that's the ask from a lot of the voices inside Israel.
Yes, I mean, there are three parts to your questions. Let me start with the first, which is the type, when of the retaliation. I think one thing we know, there will be a retaliation. When, how, I don't know. Whenever I'm doing any briefing about Hezbollah, I always start quoting this sentence, by a very famous Chinese philosopher: those who know don't speak, and those who speak don't know. This does not mean that I mean, very few people, especially on this issue of type and when, are involved in the decision-making circle. And any leaks we hear or we get from Hezbollah, these are intentional leaks and have to be analyzed accordingly. Anyway, I mean, there are two files that Hezbollah need approval and go ahead from Iran. Have always been the case, remain the case, and that will be a way of answering your question. The two files has always been war and peace issues. So whenever there is a war, any decision on war and peace, be it engagement in a war against Israel or engagement in the Syrian conflict, That would have required consultation, but also an okay from Iran. I mean, a go ahead. And if there is a veto, Hezbollah will not proceed on this. And then the second point, the second file that Hezbollah always needs a go ahead from Iran on is anything involving the US, dialogue, relations, like the maritime deal, for example, mediated by the US 2 years ago. That would have involved a go ahead or approval or no veto, at least, from the Iranians. Having said that, so my answer would be why the delay is that because Iran has not yet given the go ahead, and it's being for reasons that Iran experts know better than I do about. But whatever you hear from Hezbollah people, Hezbollah officials, the leaks that are getting out is that this kind of reply is subject to very complicated analysis and calculations, which means that they are still, trying in consultation with Iran about the timing, whether they would need the response, the timing, and how, and whether it's going to be an access response or whether it's going to be a Hezbollah response. That's in my opinion what explains the delay. The second question has to do with whether they are awaiting the ceasefire. Yes, they are awaiting the ceasefire negotiation. Look, Hezbollah is trapped. It's trapped in a dilemma of its own making. When it entered this war of support for Gaza, I think their calculation is that it's not going to be that long. It's not going to last 10 months. That at some point there will be a ceasefire deal. And the longer this war protracts, the higher the diminishing returns for Hezbollah politically inside Lebanon. Initially, there was support, sympathy for the Palestinians, for Hezbollah's support of the Palestinians across Lebanese society. I think as I monitor the debate inside Lebanon, I think as this war progresses, somebody mentioned how many people died. 560, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health today, this morning, 564 dead Lebanese. That's about, of whom we are talking about 423 maybe Hezbollah fighters, 1,848 wounded, 110,000 displaced. These are communities. These are Hezbollah communities. These are border Hezbollah communities. And then 150,000 citizens remain in the 15-kilometer zone of the blue line, which is a zone that is impacted by daily strikes today. So, and there is no end. So basically, Nasrallah can give all the speeches he wants, but so far he hasn't provided a roadmap of how this is going to end, how this is going to finish, And so ceasefire negotiations were one way to save face. It doesn't mean they will not retaliate. I think they will retaliate to shooters. They have to. But it was a way for them to basically do a different kind of retaliation and to start to offer a roadmap for the constituencies, especially Hezbollah constituencies, of how this is going to end. So I think, yes, they are delayed because, as I said, there is coordination and because they need the ceasefire deal. Now, whether it's clear Netanyahu is not going to give them that, but they need the ceasefire deal. And the last point, the last question you asked about, I forgot, what was the last question? Concessions. There is a plan. Look, there is a Hawkstein plan, okay, of 3 stages that has been on the table. That is, in principle, has not garnered a Hezbollah veto. In principle, right? But and it provides a way for basically, it's not 1701, 100%. It's 1701 light in terms of application, and it gives both sides, Israel and Hezbollah, what they each need. Now, going back to Raz, Hezbollah's problem is that it has linked any negotiation on this plan, which again, it has not vetoed. It has not accepted, but it has not vetoed, which is the big deal for Hezbollah. It has linked it to a ceasefire deal in Gaza. That's the trap again for Hezbollah, is that I think in principle they would like to see that, but as long as this is linked to the ceasefire deal, they are stuck being there, and they are not finding an easy way out for them. So they will be ready, as part of that deal to implement part of 1701, which is, again, part of it is removing some of these Radwan forces within certain kilometers. Now, how many kilometers, that's, I think, debatable, that's negotiable. But I think, yes, they will be ready. The problem is that the ceasefire deal in Gaza, absent that, I don't see negotiation on that plan starting between Israel and Lebanon indirectly. One last point. I think Raz, I mean, he's more of an expert on what's happening in Israel, and I don't doubt that. But I think there is a point that to be added, that a war this time between Hezbollah and Israel, yes, it will impose high cost on not only Hezbollah, but on the Lebanese, but also it will impose high cost on the Israel and the Israeli society. And so the question is, you know, will Israeli political leadership, particularly the prime minister, you know, is he ready to have these costs imposed on his society?
Okay, thank you, Randa. As we were discussing kind of the expansion of the war on the Lebanese border, let me go to Sheikh Nawaf to ask a question, and then I want to discuss Iran with Hamid Reza and Raz. Sheikh Nawaf, Qatar, Egypt, and other Arab nations have often represented what could be termed the moderate camp in the region, consistently proposing diplomatic initiatives and focusing on mediation to de-escalate tensions and achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. How do you think Qatar and its fellow Arab nations, including the GCC countries, would respond if the conflict were to escalate further into Lebanon, or if a direct war were to break out between Israel and Iran? What would be the implications for the region, in your opinion?
Well, in one word, disastrous. That's the implications. The immediate issues discussing, obviously, when we look at the GCC countries, it'll be issues of the natural gas and oil that is exported to the Gulf. That would be something that many countries in the region, all the countries that export oil, will be concerned about. Internationally, and the global community will be also affected by that. But also striking a balance. I think most GCC countries, all GCC countries, but most Arab countries would respond by seeking a balanced diplomatic end. Now, will broader war happen? That's highly unlikely. But I also am not in the camp of those who believe that this is not escalating. I hear what Randa said, and I think a lot of what she said is reasonable. But escalation is already here. It's not a theory. Those who said Iran would never attack Israel, they have their proxies. If they need to through their proxies, well, Iran attacked Israel. Now, the effectiveness and well, it was for show. That doesn't mean that the goalpost has moved. And I don't think anyone would gamble with the fact that could broader conflict happen. It is happening now. It has happened in the past. That is one indication that it could happen again. But also we're seeing new escalatory elements that were not there. I wouldn't call it broadening the conflict, but escalatory elements. We look at the Red Sea with the Houthis. We look at, again, what was mentioned a lot here with Hezbollah and Lebanon. There is the teetering Lebanese economy, the issue of the president. So Lebanon is not in a good situation. It needs all of our help, and this doesn't help the situation. So there are micro escalations that are happening that shouldn't be ignored because it's not, full-on war. But looking at what's happening in Iraq, the attacks on U.S. forces in the past, and to a certain extent still happening, all of those micro escalations are serious escalations and are changes from what happened in the past. Now, all of this depends on right now focusing on Gaza. The negotiations, again, hope is dwindling, unfortunately, and optimism with it. But those main issues and main elements should be met. Now, the Israelis have obviously a responsibility. The Israeli population have a responsibility to own their own, their own future, if one would say, because with this neoconservative, neocon movement that is strengthened globally, and now we see it with the Israeli government, I think that's very difficult for those moderate voices in Israel to accept that continuous conflict, if not continuous war, is a future that that should be looked for. And while the Knesset, as I see here, they're not in session, maybe members of the Knesset should go to Kikar Hahatufim and the square of the kidnapped and sit with their fellow citizens and look for a different solution that goes beyond this new conservative wave of it's either war or nothing else. Continuous escalation, even micro escalations, will lead to a bigger escalation in one point or another, and hoping it away won't resolve the issue. I think that is the GCC view. And certainly, if they're asked as GCC countries to rebuild parts of Gaza, to invest in Lebanon, to join the United States and Europe, to invest in other initiatives, a lot of GCC countries would be thinking twice before any investment in something that doesn't have any future life.
Thank you, Nawaf. Hamid Reza, let's talk about Iran. In April, after Israel targeted Iran's consulate in Damascus, Iran retaliated by launching hundreds of drones and missiles at Israel. Iranian officials stated that this operation, which they called it Operation True Promise, was meant to establish a new equation, which is basically direct retaliation for any Israeli attack on Iranian assets. However, subsequent events suggest that this equation hasn't held up. We first had the suspicious attack on Iranian air defense systems in Isfahan, then the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, as well as the targeting of IRGC Quds Force officers in Syria by Israeli airstrikes. Iran has not responded yet. What is behind Iran's apparent restraint? Are they cautious of triggering a direct war with Israel? Are they deterred by US military deployments in the region, or are they waiting for ceasefire negotiations as well?
Let me start by let me build on what Randa said, as she brilliantly elaborated the calculations on the Hezbollah side. And I fully agree that any kind of response by Iran and its allies is going to be coordinated. Coordinated doesn't necessarily mean that, it's going to happen at the same time, doesn't necessarily mean that each of them are going to take one part of responsibility like that. It means that the strategic decision to retaliate and when to retaliate is going to be at the level of this so-called joint operations room of the axis of resistance, as they call it. So why is the delay? First of all, there is a context, and this has to do with the Iranian view of Israeli calculations of the assassination of Haniyeh. And here is a significant difference between what we saw in April and what's going on right now. So from the Iranian perspective, Israel's goals back then, attacking the consulates, was basically it was a miscalculation by Netanyahu, as everybody would expect Iran to stick to its so-called policy of strategic patience, not to respond. And it was also seen as a part of a broader trend that was already ongoing. Israel basically, targeting the backup of the Hezbollah front, of the northern front. What I mean by backup is that, it started in end of 2023 by attacking Razi Mousavi, the IRGC guy who was in charge of logistics for Hezbollah. Then Hezbollah field commanders were targeted, and then at the embassy attack, actually, the guy who was targeted was the IRGC commander in chief, in charge of the Lebanon front. So he was the highest ranking IRGC commander in Lebanon. So it shouldn't be seen just as Iran responding to that one single incident at the consulate. It was a response to that trend. But this time, the calculation is that, it is actually, this notion of Netanyahu's trap for Iran by targeting Haniyeh and trying to basically drag Iran into a war that would necessarily involve the United States. plus, and totally related to that, the assessment, as far as I can see on the Iranian side, that Netanyahu's bigger goal is to continue the war as long as possible, at least until the US election, so that Trump would come and then he would have a better support for whatever he wants to do, whether it's a better ceasefire deal or whether it's going to be a kind of a war against Lebanon, whatever. So these are the sort of the calculations at the strategic level that hinders the response. But there are also some of them you already mentioned, the kind of more technical issues, again, based on what I can follow from the narrative. So first thing, which is quite important, is, and it has to do with that kind of calculation of a trap or not. One thing is kind of frequently discussed, and that's the potential for more or less prolonged conflict as a result of a response by Iran and its allies. So they know that, considering that Netanyahu has this goal, in their own narrative, and considering the need for the restoration of deterrence, so these two combined, if and when we do strike Israel, we need to expect a response, and that response may actually result to at least a few days or maybe a few weeks or longer conflict, involving tit-for-tat attacks between Iran and Israel, Hezbollah and Israel. So this is maybe the worst case scenario they are considering, but they need to get prepared for that. And that needs preparations not only on the side of Iran, not only on the side of Hezbollah, but throughout all this network of the axis of resistance. They need to have Iraqi militias, fully on board. They need to, coordinate with the Houthis for the Red Sea front and southern front. So all this has taken time. Another issue here, which is also important, is this kind of Arba'in pilgrimage, which is already ongoing. So it's not because of out of respect for Muharram and Safar, these holy months. It's because simply because thousands of Iranian pilgrims are now in Iraq, and then if a war, if a kind of a broader conflict happens that would necessarily, again, in that context, involve Iraq, then it would jeopardize the safety of those Iranians, and also it would put the Iraqi militias, Iran-backed Iraqi militias, in a difficult position, because they need to, on one side, take care of the security of the Shia pilgrims, on the other side, get involved in the attacks. And also it may result in the closure of the airspace and land borders, so everything would be complicated. Once that's over, then it might be easier for them to decide. Then we had also some discussions about the formation of the new Iranian President Pezeshkian's cabinet. And again, not that Pezeshkian or any president in Iran is has the final say in these strategic matters of war and peace, but in my opinion, simply because Khamenei, the supreme leader, always needs someone to blame for the potential failures. So there is a need for a sitting cabinet there. If something goes wrong, there is someone to be blamed for the failure. So this is my interpretation of that. And finally, of course, the issue of the ceasefire negotiation. So there were contacts, maybe behind the scenes, obviously also publicly by Arab states, by Qatar, by other countries, asking Iran not to respond, at least as far as the negotiations are going on. And here, again, I agree with Randa that the calculations, not for the desire, I would say, not for Hezbollah, but also for Iran, is that, they want a ceasefire because they see this protracted war as basically eroding their human resources potential. For Israel, it has been costly, but these commanders, some of them being there for decades, being killed one by one, it's going to take time for really rebuild that human aspect of the axis of resistance potential. So in that sense, Iran does want a ceasefire, but giving some time to the negotiations would not be a huge deal in Iran's assessment, maybe, because if a ceasefire results in a lasting solution, then it's a good outcome. If not, and if Netanyahu sabotages the deal, then Iran may have kind of better justification for actually do whatever it wanted to do. So in one word, actually, what I want to say is that there has been a delay, and there has been also a shift in discourse in the Iranian, coming from the Iranian officials, from the harsh response to some sort of more calculated response. But my understanding is that there is going to be a response. Again, the time we don't know, but this kind of emphasis on the need for restoration of deterrence, regardless of whether it's going to happen or not, this is the main logic behind the whole retaliation narrative.
Thanks, Hamid. Raz, you study Iran closely as well, so I want you to comment on the same question I asked Hamid Reza, but also please tell us about Israel's assessment of Iran's April operations. Iranians say that their aim was not to inflict damage and casualty, but to send a message to Israel that they have the will and the capability to directly target Israel. But it clearly failed to establish deterrence. So what comes next, and what's the Israeli calculation on this?
Yeah, so first of all, I totally agree with Hamid Reza. Just to point to three main issues. One, I do think that there is a very significant dilemma in Iran right now, how to retaliate. And I think there was and probably there is still ongoing debate between, I would say, two main approaches. One, you can refer that as the Pezeshkian's approach, although I'm not sure Pezeshkian is the only one supporting this approach, which puts most of the emphasis on the issue that we should certainly retaliate, but we should not fall into this strategic trap of Netanyahu. Certainly, if it drags Iran into an unwanted confrontation, which would put much more damage, or would cause much more damage to the number one and number two and number three priorities of the new president, which is economy, and economy. And I think that when the Iranians watched what happened in Hodeidah, they certainly could have reached the conclusion that Hodeidah is not going to be the last oil facilities which could have been targeted by Israel. On the other hand, there is the second approach, I assume probably supported by the IRGC, by the Revolutionary Guards, saying, look, we've just came up with this new equation Hamid Reza was referring to. It just happened on April, and the equation was very clear. It was not just killing Iranian officers in either Syria or in Iran. If we go back to the statement by Salami, by the commander of the IRGC, days after the attack, he said any kind of attack against Iranian personalities, targets, or interests, whether inside Iran or outside Iran, will mean another military attack. And I have to remind you, a few weeks ago, an Iranian officer, IRGC officer, was killed in Syria. He was not a target. He was killed during an Israeli attack against some kind of ammunition depot. And then the Iranians had the same dilemma, whether to use the equation or not. And I think the dilemma right now is even more complicated. Now, I think there is, in my sense, a kind of a difference between the way Israel has considered what happened in April, or the Israeli public opinion, or politicians in Israel, and the way the Iranians have considered the equation. From the Israeli point of view, Iran failed to materialize this new equation. Israel continued to carry out attacks in Syria. Israel attacked Iranian targets inside Syria. And certainly the killing of Hania attributed to Israel, although Israel did not take responsibility, was another proof for this failure of so-called failure of Iran. And then, of course, the fact that Israel, together with its allies, managed to intercept more than 90% of the projectiles, was also considered as a success by the Israelis. From the Iranian perspective, I think the attack in April was considered as perhaps a tactical failure, but a strategic success. And I think that if we reach the point where Iran decides, and I still don't know what the decision will be, but if Iran decides not to carry out the same kind of military direct attack against Israel, it might show that there are some problems with trying to enforce this equation. And that, of course, could lead Iran to reassessing its strategy, because if they can't use the proxies in order to deter Israel, or it doesn't always work, and if it doesn't, and if it can't enforce this new equation because of its concerns with what's going to happen with the United States or with Israel, then perhaps there is another way, and we could perhaps discuss it in the Q&As, what to do with the nuclear strategy of Iran.
Thanks, Raz. Yeah, I hope we get time to discuss that as well, the issue of nuclear deterrence and the conversation that's going on inside Iran about potentially their move towards nuclear deterrence. Randa, I want to discuss the Biden administration policy with you. If ceasefire negotiations fail, as they're expected, the ceasefire negotiations are expected to happen this week in Egypt, do you see any possibility that we see any significant shift in the Biden administration's approach towards Israel, and in particular towards Bibi Netanyahu?
I don't think so. I think we are in the last, 4 or 5 months of this administration. I think they're going to continue their policy of working toward the ceasefire, even if there is a failure this time. They will continue working toward it, or claiming they are working toward it, coming up with more bridging proposals, deploying as much military posture as possible to defend Israel, to prevent a regional war, not regional escalation, because I agree with Nawaf, there is definitely many regional escalations, but we are talking about the regional war. I mean, this is the least costly approach for Biden. Anything else? I mean, you would think a president who is interested in getting to a ceasefire deal, facing the last 4 or 5 months of his administration, he will do something bold. I think this is not what Biden will do, and it's not in him. And I don't see that changing. And I don't see also VP Harris changing, any of its attitude if she were to win. U.S. policy toward Israel, if she were to win, you might see a change, some kind of nuances maybe, but the basic thrust, the basic drivers of U.S. policy toward Israel and toward the conflict remain in place, and I don't see them changing, except, again, if there is a major regional war, which, again, I don't think is likely to happen.
Thanks, Randa. Sheikh Nawaf, in an opinion piece you published yesterday, you said, and I want to bring a quote from it, while Netanyahu's administration continues to assert its dominance through military means, there are voices within Israel that seek a different future, one built on dialogue, coexistence, and mutual recognition. Engaging these voices could provide the international community with new avenues for promoting peace, reducing tensions, and ultimately achieving a lasting resolution. And that's the end of quote. What's the alternative way that you're suggesting here? How can the US or regional actors engage these voices in Israel while Netanyahu and his coalition remain in charge of the government?
Well, frankly, I think it is possible. We've seen it in the past in other contexts. Tony Blair, vis-a-vis the relationship with the U.S. government during Clinton administration. I don't see such a bold approach like that, but I think regional and global governments and institutions should reach out to the civil society of the Israeli communities and the Israeli populace, understanding that they are hurting as well as the Palestinians, understanding that there is an alternative future, and that alternative future shouldn't be held hostage by what is viewed, at least beyond maybe Israel, as a very robust, bold neocon approach towards peace, which is through war. I think that when I wrote that didn't come out in an instant. I was thinking about it for a few months. I spoke to some Israeli friends who used to serve in the government a few months ago, and they have different views than the current prime minister and his government. And they claim that there is those voices in Israel that do call for peace through negotiations. And I think this approach should be an avenue that we shouldn't eliminate, but actually explore and see if it is viable. Because the alternative is the current government bringing back the hostages in body bags is not something to be proud of. I think the only way to return the hostages is through the negotiations. And we've seen success from Qatar and from the United States of returning hostages through negotiations. So this is not something that we should test. It's not a theory. It's proven, and we've seen it in the past. So I think that should be something that the Israelis themselves should own first and foremost, and should internally view it. And I think the international community could support those civil society movements, those ideas, to actually flourish that idea of peace through negotiation and not through military might and forever wars. Because at the end, those who pay the price for forever wars are immediately the Israelis and the Palestinians. But on a broader scale, the American taxpayers, where Randa is, the Gulf countries where I am, and the global community, everyone will have to pitch in if it becomes another forever war. We've been through that, and I know that from personal experience. We've been through that once. I don't think the global community is ready or could stomach that again. And even those small, micro conflicts, anything could happen that could spark something in Yemen, spark something in Syria, and that is something, looking at a different avenue beyond Netanyahu, beyond the neocons, beyond those who look through war and aggression through power and military might. I think that is something that should be at least explored, and that is something I got as a feedback, and that's what drove me to write that piece.
Thank you, Sheikh Nawaf. Raz, when I come back to you later, if you would like to also comment on this, please do so. But let me shift gear a little bit and go back to talk about Iran. Hamid Reza, recently Al Jazeera journalist Ali Hashem reported, citing a senior Iranian official, that there is a high-level debate ongoing within the regime establishment in Tehran to revise the country's nuclear doctrine. In your view, how significant are these debates? Are they merely signaling, or is there a real shift within the Iranian establishment in terms of their view on their nuclear doctrine?
It's both, actually. First of all, the extent of this debate, actually, the public debate in the state TV, among some former officials, then even sitting officials, lower-ranking IRGC commanders, for example. One of them commented in April, I think. So all these indicate a real shift, at least at the level of discourse. And this is quite significant when we take into account the fact that, at least the state TV, it is quite, regulated by the sort of instructions from the government. So if there is this debate, and if there is a signaling toward potential weaponization, it means that there is at least a tacit approval, or there is non-objection from the government. So having this in mind, as I said, it's both strategic signaling and the potential shift toward a change of doctrine. So first of all, at least in the past year or two, as it became clear that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, is beyond repair. One of the things that Iran has done is to, having in mind the potential return of Trump, for example, or in any case, the potential for a new deal, especially given the current state of the Iranian economy, they started to build more leverage and by developing their nuclear program. So this new discourse can be also part of that. So basically saying that we are already at the point of no return. So if there is no move on the side of the West, Europeans, the United States, then we may take the final step. Because one of the arguments that actually is raised is that we are already paying the price for a nuclear weapon by sanctions, etc., without even without actually having it. So it's better to build it and take the final step. So this is the strategic signaling part. But when it comes to the actual nuclear doctrine, I think it is highly likely. It was actually in November, I think, Raz wrote something in Atlantic Council arguing that the erosion of Iran's deterrence and the kind of predicament that the axis of resistance is in might pave the way for change in Iran's nuclear strategy. At the time, I was more pessimistic, not in full agreement, but the more I see indications coming from Iran, the more I'm convinced that it is highly likely. So, in a nutshell, this whole network, axis of resistance, was built out of the idea of forward defense in order to provide Iran with an asymmetric means of deterrence. And now the thing is that one main pillar actually of this, which is Hamas, is significantly diminished in terms of its capabilities. There is significant danger for the key pillar of the axis, which is Hezbollah. And in the meantime, although the network has shown a great deal of consistency and coherence actually during the war in Gaza, it's become, its effect, its impact for Iran's deterrence has been more controversial, as we've seen. The network didn't prevent Iran from actually getting dragged into the war, Israeli activities, etc. So in that sense, I think if an Israeli attack happens against Iran, for example, as a preemptive attack, some people discuss, or if as a result of Iranian response, an attack against Iranian homeland, a massive attack happens, then we are going to see an accelerated shift toward this kind of weaponization discourse, and it may actually happen.
Thanks, Hamid Reza. I know that Randa should leave in 3 minutes, right at 12:15. So let me ask you, Randa, a question from our audience. VOA reporter is asking, I'm going to read the question: what are the main obstacles to getting this ceasefire deal done? So exactly the kind of the points, the sticking points that right now are kind of in contention between the parties in the negotiations. Has U.S. adopted the right negotiation approach with Hamas and exerted sufficient pressure? Please go ahead. You're on mute.
On the Hamas issue, I think one can debate how much influence Qatar and Egypt have on Sinwar. I mean, they definitely have influence on Haniya. Also, one could debate how much influence Haniya had on Sinwar, but they had access. They had influence, some influence. I think with Sinwar now being the leader of Hamas, there is debate about, and that's why, in my opinion, you are going to see the Qatari foreign minister heading to Iran. There is this assumption that Iran has more influence on Sinwar than either Egypt or Qatar. So has the US adopted the right strategy in terms of negotiation and mediation? I don't think so. I think this strategy of unconditional support for Israel, refusal to deploy sticks in coordination with the carrots, I think has basically put us where we are, and the Biden administration, will eventually be judged accordingly on its failure in the mediation. The real obstacles now for the ceasefire, the main issue is the Israeli military presence along the Gaza-Egypt border, the Philadelphia corridor. And as I said, it's an issue that involves not only Hamas and Israel. Hamas refuses any presence of Israeli soldiers on that border. But also now it involves Egypt, because it runs counter to the Egypt-Israel treaty. It runs counter to the 2005 understanding or agreement after the Israeli withdrawal from the crossing. And Egypt is seeing it as violating its sovereignty. So the bridging proposal now is, let's figure out of basically what kind of military presence need to be there, if not Israeli, that can meet Israel's security interest, but at the same time that can basically meet Egyptian demand and Hamas demand of not having Israeli military presence there. And so can we think of an Arab force? Can we think of a US force that can be present there? And then maybe present there in a first stage. Remember, the deal that Biden has put forward has 3 stages. So the first stage is a temporary ceasefire, and then this is where the issue of Israeli military presence on this crossing is important. And what is the bridging proposal there? And then in the second stage, the negotiation toward a permanent ceasefire. Hamas has already given up on its previous demand of having this commitment, Israeli commitment to a permanent ceasefire from the beginning. So they have agreed to a temporary ceasefire in the first stage, and then the negotiation to follow in the second stage. But the sticking point right now, as far as I know, and Ras might know more, is this Israeli military presence on the border, which Mr. Netanyahu has defined as a security interest, as a strategic interest for Israel.
Thank you, Randa, and thanks for joining us today. Sheikh Nawaf, I want to ask you to respond to this question, if you would like to add any points as well, and then I'll go to Raz and we'll finish the conversation after. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, it took the IDF, 8 months to get the Philadelphia corridor, sorry. It's not as easy as it seems. At least from a military strategic perspective, it is a challenge. Now, there are political challenges towards that as well. Randa mentioned Egypt, legal challenges. She also mentioned the treaty. Now, Arab forces, I think Arab nations have kind of shied away from that idea. A peacekeeping force. Well, peacekeeping force is a complicated question. Is it a UN peacekeeping force? Well, it should be then asked by the Palestinians. The Palestinians don't have a state or an authority that could move forward. They could technically, there is the responsibility to protect doctrine, but all of that will protect the Palestinians and not the Israelis. The Israelis want their own security. So again, even a peacekeeping force is not a peace for Israel. It is to secure the population that requests that. Now, some would say, well, the Israelis as an occupying force could ask for a peacekeeping force. And now you're putting one legal complication inside of another legal complication. And things that are clear and easy find difficulty through the Security Council. You can imagine how something that is quite complicated could find its way through the Security Council, which makes it a bit difficult. Not impossible, but a bit difficult, certainly at this stage. Any effort to secure Gaza and the people there or the Israelis should come from a non-complicated approach. The Americans and the Qataris and the Egyptians have tried to make this process as simple as possible. 3 main avenues, which is a cessation of violence. That's the first thing. Second thing is humanitarian aid for the Palestinians and release of the hostages. That is the structure. Burdening it that by demands beyond the scope of the agreement or the proposed ceasefire is something that will just, as we see, lead to it to fail. Now, when it comes to the current peace talks, the current discussions and negotiations, we know that the Israeli security elements, leaders and the negotiators are on their way to Egypt to have that discussion. Maybe by tomorrow or Friday, we'll see, a greater, a bit better picture. Randa mentioned Iran and Qatar. No one can influence either Qatar or the United States. This is very confusing for some. Influence is limited in scope. You can encourage, you cannot coerce. If you start coercing, then you cannot influence. You have to be an occupying force, and then you can, dictate, and even then that fails. But you can try to advise, but you can't coerce, and influence is very limited in scope, whether for Hamas vis-a-vis Qatar, for the United States with Israel, and I know some people may be surprised by what I say, but it is limited. There is a limit to what any country can do. Now, we've heard reports about the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar probably visiting Iran tomorrow. That is, if it happens, and we don't know, there's just been reports, that is not unusual. Iran is a big country. Qatar is a very active country in the region, and negotiating the negotiations happening vis-a-vis Iran and Gaza and Hamas, something that interests all parties. Now, all of that hinges on, again, being focused, but burdening it with other elements of, well, how about Israel's security in 10 years or 5 years, or, the idea of two-state solution. Today is not the time or the day to discuss that. I think focusing that, and that is the main challenge, is there is no focus on that. And I'll end with this one last comment that, for instance, the Prime Minister of Israel said after meeting with Blinken and mentioning that, he's on board with the bridging solutions, he came out and said, well, but that excludes the ending of the war. Well, that's a very confusing statement. If the war continues, but the fighting stops, what does that mean? Does it mean, like, some would say mowing the lawn, as some Israelis would say, go in every now and then? Well, that is not a sustainable solution. That is just a compounding solution, kicking the can down the road, as the Americans would say. So this is very complex, and making it simple and focusing on those three issues, in my view, is the last hope for whatever happens in Egypt in the next couple of days has for it to succeed.
Thank you, Nabaf. Raz, last question to you. First of all, if you would like to comment on the question that I asked Hamid Reza about the question or the debate on nuclear deterrence inside Iran, please do so. But also, I want to ask you a question that we got from our audience regarding China's role. I know that it may not be necessarily your area of research and study, but I remember actually reading something on this from you on your Twitter, if I remember correctly. Why is China absent? We know that they negotiated or they mediated a deal between different Palestinian factions a month ago, I think it was. But other than that, they have been kind of absent, at least in the ceasefire negotiations. So if you would like to say anything on that, I appreciate it as well. Thank you.
So I agree with everything Hamid Reza said. So I actually wanted to respond to what Shahnawaf said about the Israeli politics. And I have to say, unfortunately, as one of the voices who support negotiations and reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians, I find it very difficult to share the optimistic views. I have to say that when I look at the politicians, the Israeli politicians from the center and the left, and certainly on the Israeli public opinion, any discussion right now on the possibility of reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians, certainly the two-state solution seem to be very remote. And I think that even within the so-called centrist elements in Israel, which could provide an alternative to the current government in Israel, you can hear more and more about this scenario that we will continue some kind of fighting in Gaza as we see in the West Bank, and that even those who support a ceasefire in Gaza consider that as the first stage in order to rehabilitate Israel military, economic, social capabilities in order to prepare ourselves for the second stage of the so-called war against Iran and the axis of resistance, meaning either Iran's nuclear facilities or Hezbollah. Concerning China, I'm not an expert on China, but I have to say that looking at the very hard and difficult mediation work carried out by both Egypt and Qatar, which haven't reached until now the results, I find it very difficult to believe that a country like China, who has been very clear in its position since the beginning of the war supporting Hamas, I'm not sure China by itself really wants to be engaged in this very delicate and sensitive issues. China's motivations are mostly economic. and I'm not sure that we should expect China to take any real role in this kind of negotiations, which really requires regional players who have contacts and connections and leverage on either Israel or Hamas.
Thank you, Raz. And with that, we're coming to the end of this discussion. Hamid Reza, Raz, Nawaf, and Randa, who was with us earlier. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. And thanks to our attendees, our viewers who join us today as well. A recording of this discussion will be available on IPD's YouTube channel. So please go there if you would like to rewatch parts of this discussion, or if you would like to share the recording with your network and your colleagues. Also, please make sure to visit our website at peacediplomacy.org for future discussions and more analysis on the situation in the Middle East. We'll follow the developments and definitely will organize more discussions like this with the distinguished experts we hosted today and others. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. Goodbye.